What are the basic elements of a screenplay?
Air, water, fire, earth.
From concept to structure to dialogue and action lines, this is week 2 of Delusional, and I'm going to focus on all of these things and more. I'm Nathan Graham Davis. I'm a Hollywood screenwriter living in Massachusetts, and if this is the first video you've seen from this series, then congratulations, you've stumbled upon a one-of-a-kind 15-week screenwriting course, and you don't have to pay me a thing for it. I've made my living as a screenwriter for a couple years now, and I got there largely because of all the help I received from other writers along the way, so this is just me paying it forward. If you want to know more about this course or me, go check out Class 0 where you can find out if this is for you. To those of you who are currently taking this course, congratulations on not quitting after week 1. Success in screenwriting requires an extreme amount of not quitting, so extreme that you kind of have to be delusional, so you're off to a good start already. You have now read your first script of the course, and perhaps even your first script ever. You've come up with 3 ideas for a short screenplay, and you've also downloaded some screenwriting software. If you haven't completed those assignments yet, do them before you keep watching. This course builds upon itself, and you're not going to get the foundation you're seeking if you skip ahead. This week, we're going to cover the basics of a screenplay and give you a few tips around those things, arming you with tools to help you write your short. A couple quick housekeeping things before we begin. First of all, if you haven't found your writing group, stop now and go do that. I understand that it might feel a little awkward or even intimidating to reach out to others for this purpose, but you need to do it. This course doesn't work without that group, and this career doesn't work without an ability to connect with others and put yourself out there. So this is an opportunity to start building that skill. Second, to those of you with a little more experience, let's say you've written a full feature or even a pilot before, this will be the most basic of all the classes. And if you're worried that I'm about to bore you, look at the video chapters in the description of this video and skip any that you feel you're already an expert in. This is the only class of all 15 in which I'll recommend doing this. Again, everything in this course is meant to build upon itself, and honestly, there's probably something you'll pick up from this one, but either way, just make sure that at the bare minimum, you do this week's assignments. Anyway, hopefully you took a few minutes to jot down something that you learned from the script that you read last week. If not, pause the video, do it now, and do it every time you write a script for the remainder of this class. There's a decent chance that we're going to touch on some of the things that you picked up on or wondered about, and having written something down will only help it stick better. Your ideas about story will evolve over time. You may read things in one script that seem to contradict things that you've learned from others, and that's okay. And in fact, I think it's a really good thing. Contradictions and exceptions are integral to art, and movies are no different. Taking the time to study and question those things will help you learn why some of the rules of storytelling work so well, how you can use them to your advantage, and when it makes sense to break them. Anyway, this week, the very first super incredibly important thing that I want to talk about is concept. A common question writers get is, how do you come up with your ideas? The follow-up question is often, how do you know which idea to write? That second question is way more critical than most people realize. The idea that you choose to write should come down to a combination of marketability and passion. If you aren't passionate about the idea, you're going to have trouble even finishing it, let alone writing it well. It takes a lot of work to write an entire screenplay and then rewrite it several times. Why would you invest all that energy into something that you don't even care about? And then, of course, there is marketability. Unless you're making movies with your own money, there's no getting away from the business side of this. If someone is going to pour many millions of dollars into making your film, they need to feel reasonably assured that they can get people to pay to watch it. And that begins with your concept. Finding that perfect overlap is hard. It's so hard that many otherwise really solid writers will spend months of their lives writing ideas that are merely decent. And that's a problem, because regardless of how well they're written, merely decent ideas rarely get people excited, which means that it's an uphill battle to get them to read them. Put yourself in the shoes of a producer who gets 100 query emails a week and who only has time to read maybe 3 of those scripts. These are people whose literal job is to pull off the impossible and get movies made, and you can't blame them for picking ideas that seem like they would make the most viable movies. There is a lot of information in this course, and I hope that you will find most of it useful. But if there's only one thing that you take away from it, in addition to adopting a long-term mindset, it's that you should put the effort into your concepts up front. Your time is valuable. Spend it as wisely as possible on the best concepts possible. One of your assignments last week was to come up with 3 concepts for a short script with no dialogue. That was a bit of a stretch assignment since we didn't talk about how to generate these ideas or even define exactly what a concept is. And that was by design. These short scripts are an opportunity to dive in and learn to swim a little bit. So have fun with them and give them your best, but try not to overthink them. We will refine all of these techniques as we move on to your features. But now that we're here, let's go ahead and define the word concept as it applies to movies and screenwriting. A simple Google search would bring you a bunch of definitions, but for our purposes, I want you to keep 4 things in mind. A setting or scenario, the lead character or characters if it's like a rom-com or a buddy movie or something like that, the lead character's primary goal, and the primary antagonist or antagonistic force. In the movie world, we put these concepts into what we call loglines. These are typically 1 or 2 sentences that describe the movie in the fewest words possible. Let's take Jurassic Park. I saw that movie in theaters with my dad when I was 8, and it was like the formative movie experience for me. So much so that when the 30th anniversary release came out in 2023, I absolutely had to take my own kids. It is amazing how well that movie still holds up. And even though it's based on a book, it's pretty much a perfect cinematic concept, which is why it spawned so many sequels. When you ask your average person what the concept of Jurassic Park is, they might say, oh, well, these scientists, they figure out how to bring dinosaurs back to life and they fill a park with them and then everything goes crazy. And that's not wrong, and it's a fantastic setting and scenario, but there are a lot of dinosaur movies out there that nobody remembers. In fact, there are Jurassic Park movies out there that nobody remembers. And that is because the character piece and their goal is so important. If I were going to try and put Jurassic Park into logline form, I would do it kind of like this. A paleontologist who hates kids is invited to a top secret park where dinosaurs have been brought back to life. But when the power goes out and strands him with the owner's children, he must find a way to protect them and get them back to safety. Now that is a concept. Could you play with the logline and chop off a few more words? Yeah, sure, absolutely. But as a whole, it works. It's got the core pieces you need to pitch it and get somebody excited. For many writers, crafting a logline is a core part of their process. Having these elements figured out ahead of time makes it easier to just stay on course. And just as importantly, it's a way to make that idea feel more concrete and help us generate enthusiasm for it, like the passion that I feel about that Jurassic Park logline. We are committing to these things for a very long time, so whatever we can do to build that excitement only helps us. We are going to cover the topic of concept a whole lot more next week, but this should help you refine your thinking about your short script ideas, and obviously, as you begin to toy with ideas for your feature, be sure to consider these elements as you do. Alright, so let's take a closer look at each one. Setting is something that I've come to value a whole lot more over the past few years, so let's do a quick thought experiment to underscore how much it matters. Think of the setting of one of your favorite movies. Now take that movie and imagine it in a wildly different setting. So imagine Lord of the Rings, but instead of Middle-earth, Frodo and Sam's entire adventure takes place in Disney World. Could it work? Yeah, sure, especially since Disney World has such a rich set of characters and locations, but it is a vastly different movie. It would be impossible for the tone to be the same. Instantly, it becomes something that has a different kind of humor running through it, whether you were to play it in a lighthearted way or in a way that's more sinister. So choosing a setting wisely is critical. And this is true for any story, but it's even more important when it comes to filmmaking because setting not only impacts tone, it also impacts the budget, which has a big impact on the likelihood of it getting made. It is definitely part of why my movie Aftermath got made. There are lots of movies out there that have basically what is a Die Hard type setup, where a group of bad guys attack some contained location and a hero has to take them down one by one. But there are no movies where that setup happens on a bridge. And what's nice about a bridge is that if you choose the right bridge, it's an inherently cinematic location. You've got big sky and water and cityscape backdrops. The bridge itself opened up new action set pieces that hadn't really been seen before. Not all of those made it into the movie due to budget, but they definitely got people excited when they read it. Now, I would have loved to see the $50 million version of Aftermath, but it's possible that movie never would have gotten made. But because the bridge is such a contained location, Voltage Pictures knew they could do it for closer to $10 million, and here's why. When the entire cast and crew and all of the equipment move from place to place, that's called a company move. Company moves require lots of trucks and lots of time, which means lots of money. Aftermath needed very few of those. They shot a little bit of practical stuff on the actual Tobin Bridge and then built a 140-foot section of it inside a soundstage. They surrounded that with a blue screen and shot most of the movie there. That one set was expensive, but it was also like the only set they needed. And that was one of the reasons they could justify that green light. So as you think about your setting, think about places that will feel cinematic and give your movie a unique feel, setting it apart from other things that you've seen before. It doesn't need to be contained, but if you're targeting a modest budget, which can be smart, try and find settings that can at least be controlled or that won't cost a ton of money to build. These decisions increase your chances of getting something made, and it's easier to figure it out at the beginning rather than rework an entire script around a brand new setting. Another thing that I picked up in more recent years came from reading Kurt Vonnegut's thoughts on writing. He felt it was critical to establish the setting as clearly and quickly as possible, and I think he was right. Sometimes there's an inclination to leave your audience in the dark in order to create a little bit of mystery, but the truth is, the faster you can ground them in the setting, the faster they can just relax and focus on the story. And that's exactly what you want. So, going back to our basic elements, the first clue that we give readers to any setting is in the slug line. Slug lines tell us three things. They tell us whether the scene takes place inside or outside, which is denoted by an abbreviated interior or exterior. They describe what the setting is, usually about in like 1 to 5 words, and they tell us what time of day it is. Most often we only use day or night, but dawn and dusk can also be appropriate. The reason for this formatting is because it supports production crew in terms of lighting, scheduling, set design, and those kinds of things. We are going to spend an entire class on characters, and honestly, you could probably do a whole course on the subject, but I want to talk about 3 basic things to get you thinking as you work on your short. The best characters are typically empathetic, active, and authentic. By empathetic, I just mean that we can empathize with who they are and why they do what they do. It's great if our protagonists or heroes and other leads are also likable, but they don't have to be, as long as we feel for them and find them fascinating. This also tends to be true about our antagonists. If we can understand the human need that drives them to do what they do, it makes them all the more interesting, and often it makes them even scarier because we get the intense drive they have to succeed at getting in our protagonist's way. An active character is simply one who is proactive in going after their goal. The plot happens because of their actions. Passive characters, ones who spend most of the movie reacting to things that happen, are almost always less interesting to watch. This is true even in movies like slashers, where protagonists are running from something or someone. If the protagonist is only running, that gets boring quickly. But if they're actively trying to do things and making choices to get the upper hand, it becomes interesting. It helps define their character and we become more engaged. In terms of authenticity, what I'm talking about here is a character that is consistent with who they are and who doesn't take actions that feel unnatural, illogical, or out of character for the sake of moving the plot forward. Audiences tend to be unforgiving about that kind of thing. I'm sure you can remember plenty of times where you've watched a movie and a character has done something that no real person in their shoes would have ever done, causing you to roll your eyes hard. Just 1 or 2 instances like that can spoil an entire film, and yet it's such an easy trap to fall into as we're trying to juggle all of the balls that we've got up in the air. So remember, we want characters to inform the plot, not the other way around. Also, a formatting tip as you write your short scripts: always capitalize a character's name the first time that we meet them. Okay, so we've got our concept, we've got our characters, and our setting. Last week, I mentioned a William Goldman quote, "No one knows anything." Goldman was a super accomplished screenwriter and novelist. Among other things, he wrote the book and the screenplay for The Princess Bride. And he found those 2 mediums to be very different from each other. He had another quote, "Screenplays are structure." But what does structure even mean? Basically every movie, even a non-linear flick like Pulp Fiction or Memento or an experimental David Lynch type movie, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's pretty much what people are talking about when they mention a movie's 3-act structure. But structure does go beyond that beginning, middle, and end, and there are lots of ways to approach and think about it. For instance, you can think of it as scaffolding that supports your movie. My friend Martin Aguilera likes to think of screenplays as symphonies with a bunch of 10-page movements, each rising to a crescendo before leading into the next one. You can think of it like a roller coaster. You've got a setup in the beginning that takes a little time, building up tension and momentum as you keep rising until the floor drops out from under you and the ride just goes. You have all sorts of crazy stuff that happens in the middle of the ride, which is what the ride is really about, and quite often there's some kind of interesting, memorable event or twist at the end. And then it comes to a stop and you feel a sense of relief and elation and you get off the ride and go about your day. And also, the ride doesn't just coast along on flat ground at 5 miles per hour for a few minutes before it ends. There's excitement like right up until those final few seconds, because that's all you really need to catch your breath. Sometimes I'll actually draw something like this on paper as I'm trying to figure out the basic structure of a script, and I'll write in major plot points in those peaks. Typically, the dramatic tension in a movie goes up and up and up, with occasional small moments that give us a chance to breathe before it ratchets up yet again. Plot points are simply moments that increase the stakes or change the direction of the movie and help carry us through it. Some plot points that writers commonly talk about are the inciting incident or the catalyst, which is the event that kicks off the whole movie. You've got your protagonist kind of living out their life in this status quo, and then something horrible or wonderful happens that upsets that status quo. The break into Act 2 is usually a kind of climactic moment that leads us into Act 2. Here, the protagonist's world changes, either literally or figuratively, and they also usually make a big, active decision to pursue their goal. There's the midpoint, which is often something of a twist or a major elevation of the stakes that turns the movie on its head. It's also often a point of no return. There's the Act 2 climax, or the break into Act 3, where the protagonist typically summons their strength one last time to try and overcome the primary antagonistic force. And toward the end of Act 3, you get the climax of the entire movie, which is the height of its emotional tension. That's followed by a quick denouement that kind of wraps everything up. So, to use Jurassic Park again, the inciting incident is when John Hammond shows up and invites Dr. Grant and Ellie to the park.
What the hell do you think you're doing in here? Hey, we were saving that!
For today, I guarantee it.
We break into Act 2 when they first see the dinosaurs and are like, holy shit, this is real. And now we're in this whole new world and they are suddenly faced with both the awe and the implications of all of it, knowing that their job is to sign off on its safety. The midpoint is when the power goes out. And the Act 2 climax is when they work together to turn the power back on and Timmy also explodes off of the electric fence. The climax of the movie is when the raptors are chasing the kids and Grant has to protect them until the T-Rex can save the day, and the denouement is them fleeing the island in the helicopter safe and sound, with Dr. Grant realizing that, hey, those kids are actually pretty cute after all. For the short scripts that you're about to write, you might not have a midpoint or all of the things that I just talked about in there, but you should have a clear beginning, middle, and end. At the bare minimum, there should be a plot point that moves us from the beginning to the middle, another that moves us from the middle to the end, and a climactic moment right up in those final 30 to 60 seconds. Another thing that you might not bother incorporating into your shorts, but that is worth being aware of, is theme. Theme is something that a lot of people would say is not a basic element of a screenplay, and I think I used to agree with that, but I definitely don't anymore. I think it can be really helpful when crafting a story, and it's typically one of the first things I think about after I've got those 4 basic elements of concept: the setting, the protagonist, their goal, and the major antagonistic force. And often when I find my theme, it informs some of those things and helps me build them out. We're going to spend the better part of an entire class on theme, but let's define it real quick before we move on. A theme is essentially a thesis statement. It's what the story is truly about. Even if it's not readily apparent to the audience, and it's often not, they're going to feel it on a deeper level when it's well executed. In Jurassic Park, you might describe its theme as nature finds a way. In Finding Nemo, it might be, if you love someone, you have to let them go. And if you watch those movies with those ideas in mind, you will see how intrinsic they are to so many elements of those stories, from little details to major plot points to entire character arcs. Now, there are plenty of writers who write without theme in mind. That's not wrong, by the way, at all. As I've said before and will continue to say, everyone has their own process, and this is a great place to illustrate that. I was at Austin Film Festival last fall, which is kind of like the biggest screenwriting conference in the world, and it featured a number of amazing panels. On one of those was Dave Holstein, who co-wrote Inside Out 2, and on a couple others was Craig Mazin, who wrote Chernobyl. Craig has an incredible take on theme that I have found to be very useful. He's a big proponent on using it to help him write, and he's created this incredible resource of his own that I'm going to have you listen to as an assignment for a later class. Dave, on the other hand, flat out said in his panel that he thinks writing to theme is a mistake. Both of those guys are exceptional writers, and their processes are kind of opposite from each other. So, great, I'm already confusing you, and it's only class 2. Look, there are so many things we can learn about how to do what we do, but at the end of the day, it's still an art form, and it will always be a little bit mysterious and murky, and that's just part of the joy of it. Me personally, I think theme can be an incredible tool for helping you move forward, and so for the purposes of this course, and just as part of learning your craft, I'm going to recommend that you experiment with it. Anyway, moving from something complex to something super basic, let's talk about action lines. This is a movie. It's a visual medium. Characters need to do stuff, and stuff needs to happen on screen. Your action lines are simply the lines that describe that stuff. Often, and I usually do this myself, writers will direct on the page by breaking their action lines into chunks based on what they see as specific shots. As a result, paragraphs are usually just 1 to 2 lines, and this is a great thing because it promotes white space on the page, and that makes for a less intimidating and quicker read. But what's really great about this method is that you can give the reader a sense of how the movie will look without actually specifying any shots to convey that. To be clear, it is fine if you need to use the odd camera movement to really get something across. Sometimes you do, but use them intentionally. Too many of them can make it a chore to read. It's almost always better if you can just make something flow. And because I apparently can't get enough of Jurassic Park, let's use it as an example once again. So from the actual script, this is right when they first get to the park after the helicopter lands. 2 large open-top Jeeps roar down the hilltop away from the landing cross as helicopter engines wind back to life and the rotors start to spin again. Okay, that's a wide shot. You can see it, right? Ellie Grant and Malcolm hold on tight in the front Jeep. Hammond and Gennaro are in the rear Jeep. Both cars have drivers. This is a tighter shot, maybe even with a couple close-ups. And again, it's pretty obvious. You get a feel for how this is probably going to look just by reading it. They pass through an enormous gate in a 30-foot high fence, which is closed behind them by 2 park attendants. Oh look, we're wide again. There are large electrical insulators on the fences, warning lights that strobe importantly, and clear signs, electrified fence 10,000 volts. And we've got a close-up on those warning lights and the sign. Pay attention as you read scripts to how different writers use their action lines. There are tons of different styles, and as long as your readers are able to feel and visualize the movie, none of them are wrong. Next, let's talk dialogue. We could do multiple advanced classes on dialogue, and we will talk about it more here and there, but here are a few tips to get you started. Dialogue should come from the character. If you know who this person is supposed to be, what their background is, and how they feel about the things that are happening, and how they feel about the characters they're talking to, that is more than half the battle. Bringing it back to authenticity, do everything you can to let the characters inform the dialogue rather than having them say things for the sake of the plot. Dialogue doesn't need to be naturalistic, but it must remain authentic to the tone. So if the movie's tone is very naturalistic, then yeah, the dialogue should sound natural. But the dialogue in Jurassic Park is always going to sound different than the dialogue in Barbie, and if you know what your tone is supposed to be, you should feel confident in applying that to the words that your characters speak. It's really easy to overdo it with dialogue, especially if you come from a prose background. Novels and short stories often have much longer blocks of dialogue than screenplays do, but in movies we really feel it. So although sometimes longer blocks will be necessary, question whether you need all those words or whether you should break them up when you start running about 4 lines or more. You'll often hear writers talk about subtext. This is simply the meaning behind the words, which is often different than what a character is saying. The grandfather in Princess Bride describes subtext perfectly. Wesley says, "As you wish," and then the grandfather reads, "But what he really meant was, I love you." When someone says something that's passive-aggressive, that's another great example of subtext. Personally, I don't think writers need to overthink subtext. If dialogue is coming from a natural place and characters are acting authentically to who they are, Subtext will often be present because that's just how people tend to speak. So yes, your dialogue should have plenty of it, but I would avoid working toward it as a goal. That said, if you're finding that a section of dialogue isn't working, that might be a clue that subtext is needed there. Transitions and specific shots are something that you won't use much, if at all, but I do want to call them out real quick so that you understand what they're for. First of all, you'll often see scripts start with fade in and end with fade out. This is more tradition than anything else at this point, kind of like writing the end, and it's less common than it used to be, but some writers still like to use them. The most common transition you'll see used in a practical way is cut to. In most cases, you really don't need this. Anytime you use a slug line, it's clear that we're cutting to a new place, but it can be a useful tool. I use it here and there, usually when I'm cutting to something in the exact same location, but just a little bit later on, because I think it indicates the passage of time better than a brand new slug line. It was used a lot in older scripts, and those examples may be less useful to you, but if you keep an eye on how it's used in newer screenplays, you'll get a good feel for when it's actually the best tool for the job. Outside of those, there's really not much that you should need for transitions. Not to say that you'll never fade slowly to black or smash cut to something for effect, but the need for those types of things is pretty rare. I'm not going to spend time on specific shots and camera movements because again, there's rarely a need to put those things into a screenplay, but if you're really intent on describing something with a specific camera movement, then all I would say is do a little bit of research. That information is everywhere online. Figure out what the difference is between a dolly movement or a tracking shot or panning and tilting and so on and so forth. The one thing that does seem to make it into some of my screenplays is either close up or close on, and I typically use this when I want to show the audience a detail that maybe my characters aren't yet privy to. But again, a lot of times I can just imply that shot without even using those words. Pacing is something that takes a while to get a feel for, but two things you should know from the start. First, screenplay formatting is designed so that one page equals roughly 1 minute of screen time. This is not 100% accurate, but it's close enough that you can assume a 90-page script is going to run about an hour and a half, and a 120-page script will be more like 2 hours. Industry standard for spec scripts these days is about 85 to 115 pages, exactly for that reason. Obviously, there are plenty of 2+ hour movies out there, but more pages means more time spent on set, and when each day can cost 6 figures or more, that time adds up quickly. With all of your scenes, do your best to come in as late as possible and leave as early as possible. Give your audience the juiciest, most interesting stuff and leave out everything else you can. I would highly recommend that when you're reading scripts, you watch for how writers do this. Also, pay attention to how they transition from one scene to the next and how they keep their scenes interesting from beginning to end. We'll talk more about these things in future classes, but it's a good thing to just start thinking about right now. If you read enough books, watch enough videos, or spend enough time in screenwriting circles online, you're going to come across all kinds of formatting rules. So how much do those things matter? Well, they matter to the extent that you want to appear professional and you don't want to give the impression that you have no idea what you're doing. But if you have a screenwriting program, your margins, your dialogue, and your action lines will all be formatted correctly, and that's like 95% of it. You might have noticed that I've been using words like usually and generally a lot. It's not because I'm not confident in the things that I'm teaching you, it's because there aren't a whole lot of fast, hard rules in screenwriting, formatting or otherwise. There are a lot of best practices though, and it's worth knowing them. Often when something is spoken about as a best practice or a rule, it's just because it's really easy to do it badly. So it's at least worth knowing why that is. Above all, your biggest 2 priorities as a screenwriter are to be clear and just not be boring. But if you do run into a formatting question, there are lots of guides online. I haven't found any that I think are perfect, but some are pretty good. And if they're helpful to you, use them. But if you're reading a lot of scripts, you should get a feel for how to format things pretty quickly. And as long as you're clear and using software for your margins, you're going to be fine. That's it for week 2. We covered a ton today, and classes going forward will be more focused on individual topics, but I wanted to give you a good baseline as you go off to write your short scripts. If you have questions, drop them in the comments. I will definitely answer some of them right here, and if you've got a really great question, you may even see me do a follow-up video about it. Before we get into this week's assignments, remember the cost of this course. You are paying yourself. You are investing in yourself. Do the work and don't skip the assignments. I promise this will all be worth it. The other cost of this course is to pay it forward. If you're getting something out of it, share the course with others. And do the like and subscribe thing because it costs you nothing and it tweaks the algorithm so more people will see it. So please take 5 seconds and click the buttons. Anyway, for your week 2 assignments, it's getting a little more real. First, read another script from that list of 20. The link is in the description below. Pick whatever one you like, but Die Hard, Get Out, Little Miss Sunshine, Seven, and Shrek will all be used as examples in this course, so at some point it'll be worth reading those ones. And if for some reason you haven't seen any of them, try and watch them soon as well because I will be spoiling them plenty throughout the class. Finally, don't forget to jot down what you learned from reading that script in your journal and consider reading the same script as the rest of your writing group. Second, choose one of your 3 concepts and write a 3 to 7 page no dialogue script. Before choosing which idea to write, may I suggest bouncing them off your writing group. And if you happen to have a concept that you could shoot for free with an iPhone or something, it wouldn't be a bad idea to choose that one. That gives you an opportunity to actually make it and see what it feels like when your words go from print to the screen, and that's a really great way to learn. But at the end of the day, write whichever one you feel most inspired to write. Remember when writing your scripts to really focus on having a beginning, a middle, and an end, and to let your characters inform the plotting rather than having the plot inform what they do. And also remember, this is 100% for practice. It wouldn't be a bad idea to share it with your group, but you don't have to share this one. So don't worry about perfection, just get the words down on the page and have fun with it. Get the pages done. As far as the no dialogue thing goes, sound is allowed and your characters can even grunt or whistle or whatever, they just can't say actual words. Other than that, have at it. That should be more than enough to keep you busy, so get to work, have fun with it, and I'll see you in another week when we'll talk extensively about concepts.